I I translated the Family of Pascual Duarte into Hindi soon after 1989, which is when Camilo José Cela was awarded the Nobel Prize. And in fact, it was the Embassy of Spain that had asked me to do the translation, and I was very happy to have a very, very renowned publisher, that is Rajkamal Prakashan, publishing the Hindi version. The Hindi version has since been gone into several reimpressions, and it has been widely read in India, particularly in the Hindi-speaking regions. So that's something which is interesting. Why this novel has captured the imagination of the Indian readers. Because every time I meet people, they say, what a novel. It was serialized in Hindustan, the Hindi newspaper, over several months. Me suena raro hablar inglés en Cervantes, pero I'm just saying that it seems strange to me to be speaking in English in Cervantes, but yeah. So I'll just be very brief, and I will certainly read out in Spanish a certain passage from the novel, and I'm going to mainly center on this novel and not on the entire obra of Camilo José Cela, which is very wide, but it is also true that his major literary reputation rests on his earlier 2-3 novels. One, of course, the very first novel, the Familia de Pascual Duarte. The second is Viaje a la Alcarria, and the third is La Colmena. Of course, he has got many other works later, but his literary reputation is built on these 3 novels, and many would believe that his later works, there have been all kinds of controversies surrounding Camilo José Cela, and I think I should share some of them with you, especially after his death in 2002. There were investigations, research done by particularly Dr. Pere Isas from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, which went into the dark side of Camilo José Cela. So here is a figure who has been awarded some of the topmost prizes, not just the Nobel, which of course is the culmination of everything which any writer would think is the last thing he would want, but even within Spain. For example, the Príncipe de Asturias, el premio Príncipe de Asturias de Letras, the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature, for example, the Cervantes in 1995. So the Cervantes is a Hispanic Nobel. So really we are talking about a writer who has been one of the most awarded writers in Spain. But we are also talking about a writer who has been surrounded by these controversies. And therefore, I think that it is important to understand that although I agree with some of the things which have come up in the research, but they are mainly about his life. For example, it is true that the Familia de Pascual Duarte in 1942, when it came up, it was a literary milestone in the post-war Spanish literature. But it is equally true that Spain in 1940s, many of the intellectuals and writers from Spain had left Spain. And they constituted what is known as La España Peregrina, the peregrine Spain. And those of writers who had stayed back in Spain, some of them had huge connections in the corridors of power, and Cela certainly was a very connected person. And it is true that the Familia de Pascual Duarte could not have come out but for his connection with Juan Aparicio, who was a very big name in, a Delegado Nacional de Prensa. So we know that Cela had all these privileges, so to say. In fact, it is common knowledge that Camilo José Cela was a part of the Francoist censorship part. So when I read this novel, when I read Familia de Pascual Duarte, it is equally true that here is a story, a very despairing story. A very despairing story of a man, and written in the picaresque mode, at a time when Spanish literature was in its triumphalist years. So you had a kind of poetry, for example, Luis Felipe Vivanco, etc., put together a big anthology, a massive anthology of what is known as the heroic poetry of Spain. Because the entire idea, the main tenets of historiography during post-war Franco was to see Spain, to see Franco as El Cid, to see the entire civil war and the winning of General Franco as a crusade, and the tenets of the historiography mainly rested on looking at an eternal Spain, reviving the memories of the Catholic imperial past, particularly the Reyes Católicos, the Catholic kings, and therefore in this kind of a imperial nostalgia, build up. For example, the poet who was most liked during the 1940s was Garcilaso. In fact, there was a revista, there was a magazine called Garcilaso where this kind of triumphalist poetry particularly was being written. So in this kind of a atmosphere, so of course the people who were anti the regime had already left, most of them had left and gone into exile, and they considered themselves as the depositories of the liberal tradition of Spain. So for the writers who had stayed back in Spain, what were the options possible? Some of them, as I said, clearly were glorifying this kind of a imperialist nostalgia which was there in the Francoist historiography. But some of them, and Cela, it's very interesting to note, certainly was not a part of the triumphalist literature. So we are talking of a writer whom it is very difficult to pace, and that's where I think the genius of Camilo José Cela lies. That though he was a writer who was closely identified with the regime, he was a part of the censor board, as I said. In fact, the investigations which are done after 2002, The Guardian, for example, of London in 2004, September, brought out this article saying that he had in fact been a spy, in the sense that he was giving information about the other writers, etc. So, I know all of this, and yet I have decided to translate this novel because I think this novel has a phenomenal literary value. And I think that is why somebody like Camilo José Cela deserves a Nobel Prize, because being what he was, living in the years that he did, he was able to write a literature which was going to become a hallmark for post-war Spanish literature, particularly those novels that were going to come in 1950s and 1960s. If we think of the social realist novel of Spain, if those of you who have read Spanish literature would remember El Jarama of Rafael Sánchez Ferlosio, which is supposed to be heralding the beginning of the social realist novel in post-war Spain, or for that matter, Tiempo de Silencio, Time of Silence, which is supposed to be the 1960s experimental novel. None of these, I would say, are not present. The 50s novel, the 60s novel, all the seeds of those novels are already present in La Familia de Pascual Duarte. So what I'm going to try and do is, I have given you a brief idea of the historical and the literary context in which Cela was writing. I've also told you the very unsavory things which have been written about Cela in the years, the last years of the 20th century, particularly after his death. I would like to say and that the family of Pascual Duarte, coming as it does in the era of this triumphalist rhetoric, is a novel of what I call the inner exile. Now, what do I mean by the inner exile? I'm using a term which Paul Illy has used to talk about much of the Spanish post-war literature. But what do I mean by the family of Pascual Duarte as a novel of inner exile? Is to, of course, on one hand, very clearly say that the military victory of General Franco which ended the 3 years civil war, marked a division of the country. On one hand, you had the Francoist nationalist Spain, and on the other hand, the Republican exiled Spain. And as I said, while the writers of España Peregrina considered themselves as the depositories of whatever was liberal in Spain, and there was no dialogue between the writers from within Spain and those outside, we find that very soon, in 1940s itself, there's an attempt at dialogue between those who are outside Spain very soon. So it's not, there is of course a recuperation of the España Peregrina after the 78, after the transition to democracy. But in 1940s itself, we find that there was a group of writers who we would say were pro-regime, but slowly there's a disenchantment with the regime because of the simple reason that if you're a sincere and honest writer, you want the liberty to write what you feel like. And I think La Colmena and La Familia de Pascual Duarte are two examples of how Spanish writers coped, with the entire, with this loss on one hand, that you are writing at a time when your entire intellectual thought, has gone away. So you are in some way left alone, you have to defend your nation. And within this, how do you write? I think that is very interesting. But I'm also very clear that the kind of novel we have in front of us is basically a novel which avoids history. So the 2 points that I'm going to make in this very short talk that I'm going to give are myth and history in Familia de Pascual Duarte, and looking at Pascual Duarte as a novel of inner exile. So that's what I'm going to do in the next 10 odd minutes. So, as I was telling you, the kind of triumphalist discourse, whether it was in poetry or even in novel, particularly in the essay, which we were seeing in the 1940s in Spain, was to basically effect a rupture with the immediate tradition and assert a continuity, as I said, with the glories of the imperial past, as well as to kind of create a narrative of one nation, one race, and one religion. So there was an interesting apposition of nationalism and fascism in the way in which the nation was being imagined. So when we come to Pascual Duarte, which is published in 1942, we find that at this particular time, 1939 to 1942, about 3-4 years in the post-war regime, there's a big gap, there's a big vacuum. Of course, there is Vicente Alexandre, who's writing, there is a whole lot of poetry being written, but in the novel, really in the 3-4 years, nothing much has come out. So when Familia de Pascual Duarte is published in 1942, actually it is celebrated by those in power, because it showed the artistic fecundity of the new regime, and of course the regime was also looking at writers whom they could elevate and put up on a pedestal. But we find that Pascual Duarte, the second edition of Pascual Duarte, was in fact banned by the censors. So this is an interesting part, that the very first edition is welcomed, Camilo José Cela is put up on a pedestal, but the very second edition of this novel is banned by the censors. So what is it there in this novel that makes it, such a big literary piece? So one thing is the very structure of the novel. The novel uses a picaresque mode. So for example, if you were to look just the beginning of the novel, which is put up on the wall there, the very first paragraph, and it says, Yo, Señor, no soy malo, aunque no me faltarían motivos para hacerlo. Los mismos cueros tenemos todos los mortales al nacer, y sin embargo, cuando vamos creciendo, el destino se complace en variarnos como si fuésemos de cera y en destinarnos por sendas diferentes al mismo fin, la muerte. I don't have an English translation, but I will read from the Hindi version that I have done. जनाब मैं बुरा आदमी नहीं हूँ, हालांकि बुरा बनने के लिए सचमुच मेरे पास थोड़े कारण नहीं हैं। जन्म के समय सब नश्वर जीव एक ही मिट्टी के बने होते हैं, और फिर भी जब हम बढ़ने लगते हैं तो नियति अपने मन बहलाव के लिए हमें भिन्न भिन्न रूप दे देती है, मानो हम मोम के बने हों। फिर हम भिन्न भिन्न राहों से चलकर एक ही अंत, मृत्यु तक पहुंचने के लिए छोड़ दिए जाते हैं. So you can see that the very start of the novel is this stark despair, a kind of determinism, it's destiny which marks our fate. Okay, so I'm also saying that this kind of an episodic structure, those of you who know Lazarillo de Tormes at least, will clearly identify with these very first lines. You know, how Lazarillo starts telling his story of life. So this kind of an episodic structure. And also one very important thing. I told you that in fact many other writers, particularly the poets, were looking at Garcilaso, El Poeta Soldado, the soldier poet of the Spanish Golden Age, who represents the glory of the empire. So Garcilaso was the model which the poets were following. It's very interesting that Cela chooses the picaresque, which was the anti-realist mode during the imperial Spain. If we look at the 16th, 17th century Spanish Golden Age novel, Lazarillo and the picaresque tradition is particularly Spanish. It is a typically Spanish tradition of an anti-realist novel, of an anti-idealist novel, a novel which talks about the dark sectors of the society. So Cela picks up that tradition, not the Garcilaso tradition. I'm not saying that it may not be available in his poetry perhaps, but I'm saying for the Familia de Pascual Duarte, he goes back to that critical anti-idealist tradition of the Spanish Golden Age and takes the whole structure of the picaresque and he kind of, we start, for those of you who haven't read the novel, I'll just take 2 minutes and giving you a resume. Pascual Duarte is writing from a prison cell. Okay? And the story, he talks about his youth from an extremely squalid family. And he goes on to describe his brute father, who dies a horrible death in a stable, talks about his mother, who's an alcoholic, and who he doesn't feel any love for. His sister Rosario runs away with a pimp, spoils her life. He gets married. His brother Mario, I'm going to read out a small passage about Mario. His brother Mario dies, very young, barely lives to 3 years old. So it's a dysfunctional family. His sister, whom he likes very much, Rosario, as I said, runs away with the pimp. His own wife, first wife, actually lands up having a child with the same pimp, and that is Lola. And finally his mother, he's constantly quarreling his mother, and the final scene in the novel, which is the culmination of this tremendista style. I'll come to what tremendismo means. The final scene is I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil all your fun for those of you who are going to read the novel, but it's the murder of his mother. He kills his mother. Now this kind of a story coming out at a time when Spanish regime, Franco's regime, wants to actually put up this entire thing of a patriarch, and the whole idea of family with the mother, the Virgin Mary being so this novel is actually a very, very dark novel. It's a dystopian novel. And the morbid details of the way Mario, this younger brother of Pascual Duarte, dies. I'll read out that passage to you. Those morbid details, and how he deflowers who's going to be his first wife Lola on the grave of his own little brother. So this is the kind of details which the censor board said no, and the second edition, as I told you, was banned. Now I'm going to just look at, or not really detail, but show you 3 images which are used in Pascual Duarte. One is this image of the Picaro. The Picaro is an outsider. He's not the common man. He's the one who's living on the margins. So those who are living. So one is this image of the outsider. Now in a nationalist Spain, this image of the outsider, because you see, exile is the opposite of nationalism. If you're in exile, if you're in the prison itself, you're outside, you're egressed from the cultural center. So here you have a Picaro-like protagonist living in the prison, so doubly exiled. So if exile is the opposite of nationalism, so Pascual Duarte's literary strategy, and the kind of vocabulary of images it's using become very, very powerful. And one can understand why the second edition was banned within Spain. Most of you will know that his next novel, not the next, but La Colmena, in fact, was not even published in Spain. The very first volume edition came out in Buenos Aires. So, yes, so as I was saying, the first is this image of the condemned outsider. The second is the image of, or doing away, or this attack on the image of the mother figure, Marianismo, doing away with the entire patriarchal family. So if the Phalangist dream of a return to a patriarchal feudalism in which the people would be seen as the repository of the nation's spiritual values and would be saved from the divisive and corrosive effects of progress and going back to that oneness of nature, we find that Pascual Duarte is quite the opposite. So one is the idea of the condemned outsider, the exile. The condemned outsider is the exiled. The second is the whole idea of hitting out at Marianismo by presenting this mother with whom he has no bond whatsoever and whom he finally kills. And the last, of course, is the image of the prisoner, which is also the image of an exile. So because he's, as I said, he's outside, he's been expelled from the society. So from within the society, but outside it. So what I'm trying to say is that this novel shows the fissures in the social discourse of Franco's Spain. And in that sense, it's a very, very important novel. The last point that I'd like to make is that of history. But because it does it, we cannot call it an anti-regime novel either, or a novel which heralds some kind of optimism or hope. It's a deeply dark novel because of its view of history. So Cela, for example, looks at history as predetermined. I showed you the very first paragraph. He said we are determined by history, by our fate to go into a certain direction. And then he shows that several passages in the novel say that you cannot change your fate. So on the one hand, there is history as a storehouse of change, where you and me can be active agents of changing our life. That's not the history. In fact, that's not what Cela is saying. He's saying the attempt to be historical itself is absurd because you cannot change history. You cannot change history. So what we find are cyclical repetitions of the same fate. The brother Mario, he escapes death once, twice, but finally dies. So this kind of that history not as a storehouse of change, but as a repetition of absurdities. And this is where he uses tremendismo, his narrative technique of tremendismo. What is tremendismo? It focuses on the ugly, the cruel, and the violent. But this entire unpleasantness, I'll read out a passage, then I think it will become clear. This is the passage about Mario's death. Mario, I told you, is Pascual Duarte's younger brother. He, from his birth, it's clear that he will never learn to speak. He's born deficient, in his abilities. So I'll just read out the Spanish first. So this is the 5th chapter, and he's talking about Mario. It starts. It says, "Pasó después algún tiempo sin que se desgraciara de nuevo." Mario, ¿no? "Pero como al que el destino persigue no se libera, aunque se esconda debajo de las piedras, día llegó en que, no encontrándolo por lado alguno, fue a aparecer ahogado en una tinaja de aceite. Lo encontró mi hermana Rosario. Estaba en la misma postura que una lechuza ladrona a quien hubiera cogido un viento, volcado sobre el borde de la tinaja, con la nariz apoyada sobre el barro del fondo. Cuando lo levantamos, un hilillo de aceite le caía de la boca, como una hebra de oro que estuviera devanando con el vientre. El pelo, que en la vida lo tuviera siempre de la apagada color de la ceniza, le brillaba con unos brillos tan lozanos que daba por pensar que hubiera resucitado al él morir. Tal es todo lo extraño que la muerte de Mario me recuerda." I'll just read it in Hindi for those of you who didn't understand the Spanish. कुछ समय तक मारियो के साथ कोई नई दुर्घटना नहीं हुई, लेकिन दुर्भाग्य जिसके पीछे पड़ा हो, वह चाहे गुफा में ही छिप जाए पर छुटकारा नहीं पा सकता। और इस तरह एक दिन वो लापता हो गया और आसपास कहीं दिखा नहीं। जब उसे ढूंढा गया तो वह तेल के पीपे में डूबा हुआ मिला। उसे रोसारियो ने खोजा। वह ठीक उसी मुद्रा में मिला जैसे कोई बेईमान उल्लू हो, जिसे हवा के किसी झोंके ने धर पकड़ा हो। पीपे के सिर पर औंधा लटका हुआ, नाक नीचे तल से लगी हुई। जब हमने उसे उठाया तो उसके मुंह से तेल की एक पतली सी धार गिरने लगी, मानो भीतर पेट में कोई लगातार सुनहला धागा काट रहा हो। उसके बाल, जो उसके जीते जी राख जैसे धुंधले रंग के हुआ करते थे, अब इतनी शानदार तरीके से चमक रहे थे कि लगा कोई भी सोचता उसके मरने से उसमें नया जीवन आ गया है। ऐसा विचित्र था वह सब, जो कुछ मारियो की मृत्यु के बारे में याद आ रहा है। सो this is the typical technique of tremendismo at its best. I think this is one of the best passages to tell you. So we find that this is not mere sensationalism. So Cela is not trying to, just use tremendismo, this kind of focus on the violent, the ugly, just as a sensational tool. In fact, it has been used to create this whole idea of a nightmare of history, that history is a nightmare. Es una pesadilla, la historia, no? So this kind of a cyclical vision, which is, this kind of creates a mythical view of history, and we find that, therefore, Cela is not really interested in demythifying official histories. What he's saying is taking history seriously itself is an absurdity. And this we find in La Colmena also, and I'm finishing my talk, that in La Colmena, the hive, we again have, Cela says that it is a pallid reflection. That's what's been put up there in the wall, that I have added a lot of water to my ink, and this is just a pallid reflection of Madrid. Another poet from the 1940s, Damaso Alonso, has got this beautiful line of, from Hijos de la Ira, he says, Madrid es una ciudad de más de 1 millón de muertos, según las últimas estadísticas. So Madrid is a city of more than 500,000 dead, according to the latest statistics. So this is the kind of dystopian view of the city of Madrid that we find in 1940s poetry, and this kind of a phantasmagorical account. You're going to see the film today. It's today, no? Today. La Colmena. And so this kind of a film, but I'm a student of literature. In terms of its literary technique, La Colmena is set the trend for this multiple collective protagonist. So there are about 300 characters, which go, but all of them irreal, almost ahistorical. So we find, for example, whether it is La Familia de Pascual Duarte, whether it is La Colmena, and of course, sitting here in 2017, we can say, as literary critics, we can say, okay, it is ahistorical, but to be writing in 1940s, in post-war Spain, surviving, and Cela, as I have already pointed out to you all, was a person with a lot of connections. He was, ¿cómo era? Marqués de Ira Flavia. Yeah, he was from a very well-established Galician family. But even so, if you're an honest writer...
Pero ese título se lo dio el rey después, ¿eh? Es que fuera antes.
Es que después, por eso, ¿no? Sí. So this title was again something which was given to him by the king. Pero después de 78 o antes?
Después del Nobel.
Después del Nobel.
Sí, sí.
Okay, después del Nobel. So so what I'm saying is, but his family was very well connected, from what one knows. So what I'm trying to say is that this kind of a writer, when we approach, we should not look at their lives, the fact that he may have played the role of an informer, whatever. I think what is important and enduring are his works, and I think Camilo José Cela paved the way for later writers to be able to create the kind of post-war literature, rich literature, that we all are reading today in Spanish and of course in translation in Hindi and in English. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias por haberme dado esa oportunidad.